and it's great to have the opportunity to talk with you today about the IESO's report on phasing out our gas-fired power plants. But before I tell you what's wrong with the IESO's report, it's important to remember a couple of important facts. And the first important fact to remember is that Doug Ford is planning to increase the greenhouse gas pollution from our gas plants by 300% or more by 2030 and by 500% or more by 2040. And if that occurs, we will lose about 40% of the pollution reduction benefits that we achieve by phasing out the dirty coal plants. And the second important fact to keep in mind is that Ontario's municipalities believe that Doug Ford is going in the wrong direction. And as a result, Ontario municipalities have passed resolutions requesting the Government of Ontario to return the gas plants' pollution back down to their 2017 level as soon as possible, and also to achieve a complete gas plant phase out by 2030. So now let's turn to the IESO report. Now, according to the IESO report that was released on October 7th, it would be absolutely impossible to phase out our gas-fired power plants by 2030. Absolutely impossible to do it, they say. And they also said, if we attempt to phase out the gas plants by 2030, then our electricity rates will skyrocket and will experience rolling blackouts. Now, all of these claims by the IESO are absolutely false and are irresponsible. Now, here's an important fact about the IESO report. Now, despite their rhetoric to the contrary, their report actually does provide a plan to achieve a 99.7% gas plant phase out by 2030. So that's good news in a way. They get 99.7% of the way there. But then they make this absolutely ridiculous claim that it would be absolutely impossible to phase out the remaining 0.3% of our carbon electricity supply by 2030. And that statement just can't be true, because we all know if we invest some more money in energy efficiency, if we invest some more money in wind and solar, and if we buy some more Quebec water power, then obviously we'll be able to increase our carbon-free electricity supply by an extra 0.3% by 2030, which is 9 years away. Now I'd like to turn to the IESO's fear-mongering. And they have fear-mongering around blackouts, and they have fear-mongering around rising electricity rates. But let's start with the fear-mongering around blackouts. They say if we try to achieve a gas plant phase out by 2030, we're going to experience rolling blackouts. Well, this is just absolutely not true. And to understand why it's not true, it's important to remember a few facts. And the first important fact is that in 2030, 20% of our gas-fired power plant capacity will still be under contract to the IESO. And some of these gas plants will remain under contract to the IESO until 2040. So what does that mean? It means between 2030 and 2040, we will have gas-fired power plants on standby reserve, able to provide emergency backup power to the Ontario electricity grid if necessary. So that means if there is a shortfall in carbon-free electricity supply in 2030 or 2031 or 2037, we're not going to experience blackouts, because if there is a shortage, the IESO will direct the gas-fired power plants to fire up and keep our lights on. So when the IESO suggests there's a risk of rolling blackouts, that's just completely false, and it's completely irresponsible, because they know that they have gas-fired power plants under contract to them to provide power to the Ontario grid right to 2040. Now let's turn to the fear-mongering about higher electricity rates. According to the IESO report, if we attempt to phase out the gas plants by 2030, then residential electricity rates will rise by 60%. Now, when most people hear a statement like that, they assume that what the IESO is also saying is that if we try to phase out the gas plants, then our costs of producing electricity will rise by 60% by 2030. That's what you would think they were saying if they say residential rates will rise by 60%. But in fact, that's not the case. The IESO report does not conclude that our electricity costs will rise by 60%. Rather, they say that to achieve a gas plant phase out in 2030, our electricity costs would have to rise by 20% by 2030. So, 2030 is 9 years away. So if we had a 2% annual rate increase for all customer groups, residential, commercial, and industrial, if we had a 2% rate increase each year until 2030, that would pay for the gas plant phase out, according to the IESO's analysis, which says that a gas plant phase out would raise our electricity costs by 20% by 2030. But here's an even more important fact when we come to the fear-mongering. While the IESO says that a gas plant phase out would raise our electricity costs by 20%, that claim is totally false. They made it by inflating the cost of phasing out the gas-fired power plants. And so how did they inflate the costs? Well, there's three major things they did to inflate the costs of phasing out the gas plants. First, they underestimated the carbon tax savings from phasing out the gas plants. Second, they ignored our two lowest cost storage options for phasing out the gas plants. And third, they included the costs of a $3 billion new nuclear reactor in the GTA as part of their gas phase out plan. So let's look at these actions to inflate the cost one by one. And let's start with carbon taxation. So the IESO's report assumes that in 2030, the gas plants will only be subject to a carbon tax of $50 a ton. And they assume that despite the fact that Prime Minister Trudeau has promised that in 2030, the carbon tax will be $170 a ton. The second way that the IESO underestimates the carbon tax savings of phasing out the gas plants is they assume that only 5% of the gas plants' pollution will be subject to the carbon tax. And so if you make these unreasonable assumptions, that leads to the IESO's conclusion that phasing out the gas plants will only produce a carbon tax saving of $30 million in 2030. Well, that's just not reasonable. If we assume that 100% of the gas plant's pollution will be subject to the carbon tax, and that the carbon tax will be $170 per ton in 2030, as Prime Minister Trudeau has promised, then the carbon tax savings from phasing out the gas plants in 2030 will be up to $2 billion. So the realistic number is around $2 billion, but the IESO has assumed the carbon tax savings will only be $30 million. Okay, now let's turn to storage. To phase out the gas plants, we need storage to help us meet our peak day demands. But the IESO has absolutely refused to analyze the two lowest cost storage options for Ontario. That is, the first low-cost storage option are Hydro-Quebec's reservoirs. These reservoirs can be used like a giant battery for our wind and solar energy. But they refuse to analyze that storage option. And they also refuse to analyze the option of installing bidirectional chargers for our electric vehicles so that their batteries can provide power to the grid during peak demand hours. Now, that oversight was a huge mistake because in 2030, the capacity of our electric vehicles' batteries will be more than double the capacity of our gas plants. And then the third way they've inflated the cost of the gas plant phase out is they are including, as part of their gas phase out plan, building a new $3 billion nuclear reactor in the GTA. And that simply makes no sense because energy efficiency, wind and solar, Quebec water power can all phase out our gas-fired power plants at less than half the cost of building a new nuclear reactor in the GTA. So that's the third way that they've inflated the cost of their cost estimate for phasing out the gas plants. And therefore, we know that their cost estimate of a 20% cost increase has just no basis in fact. So this slide is very important. It shows Ontario's carbon-free electricity options, and the lowest cost options are on the left-hand side. But I want to draw your attention to the yellow bar graph in the middle with 9.6 cents on top of it. That's the price we're paying for nuclear power today in Ontario, 9.6 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, please look at the yellow bar graph with 13.7 cents on top of it. That's the price we'll pay for nuclear electricity in 2027 if we proceed and continue with the rebuilding of Darlington's aging nuclear reactors. And finally, please look at the yellow bar graph with 16.3 cents on top of it. That is the price of power from a new nuclear reactor in the GTA. So what this slide tells you is that energy efficiency and renewable power are by far our lowest cost options to phase out our gas-fired power plants and to keep our lights on. So if the IESO really wanted to protect electricity consumers, and if they really wanted to reduce our electricity rates, then the IESO would be very aggressively promoting energy efficiency and renewables to avoid our need for much higher cost nuclear power. So what this tells us is that we need to send the IESO back to the drawing board to actually develop an unbiased, fact-based least cost plan to first return the gas plants' pollution to their 2017 level, and then to achieve a complete gas plant phase out by 2030. And if the IESO would actually develop a least cost plan, then we could phase out the gas plants by 2030 and lower our electricity bills. And so, turning to our first goal of returning the gas plants' pollution to their 2017 level, this can be done by three actions. First, we should triple our imports of low-cost water power from Quebec using our existing transmission lines. Second, we should ban our gas-fired electricity exports to the US. And third, we should purchase all the energy efficiency savings and all the solar and wind power that can keep our lights on at less than the cost of today's price of nuclear electricity. That is 9.6 cents per kilowatt hour. And if we do these three things, then we will very quickly return our gas plants' output and pollution back to their 2017 level. And in order to achieve a complete gas plant phase out by 2030, there's two additional things we need to do. We need to expand our transmission links with Quebec so that we can use Hydro-Quebec's reservoirs to act like a giant battery for our wind and solar energy. And second, we need to install bidirectional chargers so our electric vehicles' batteries can provide power to the grid during peak demand hours. So here's the good news. The good news is that since we launched our campaign in February 2020, by working together, we've made a lot of progress. First, 32 municipalities have called for a gas plant phase out. Second, Andrea Horvath and Mike Schreiner have both called for a gas plant phase out by 2030. Third, Prime Minister Trudeau has promised to make Canada's electricity system carbon net zero by 2035. And on October the 7th, Ontario's Minister of Energy, Todd Smith, sent the IESO back to the drawing board to develop a plan to phase out Ontario's gas plants by an unspecified date. But there's still a lot more we need to do between now and next year's provincial election. And here's what we believe our priorities should be. First, we need to communicate to the public, to the media and politicians that we can phase out the gas plants by 2030 and lower our electricity bills. Second, we need to persuade Stephen Del Duca and Doug Ford to endorse a gas plant phase out by 2030. And third, we need to participate in the IESO's gas plant phase out consultation process to request the IESO to actually develop least cost plans to return the gas plant's pollution to their 2017 level as soon as possible and to achieve a complete gas plant phase out by 2030. So thanks for your attention. And now, Angela, it's back to you.